Another idea of perseverance, or example of perseverance, this idea of there were those who really opposed the women flying and wanted to limit the flying that they did. One example of this that Betty Gillies, who of course was president of the 99s just before the war, Jackie Cochran was president of the 99s during the war, but Betty had worked with the 99s fighting against the CAA, of course the precursor to the FAA, in this effort to prevent women from flying when pregnant and to prevent women from flying when they were menstruating. And then the Army Air Forces in this time period decided, okay, women can't fly when they're pregnant, and oh yeah, you need to let us know when you're menstruating so that we can take you off the flight line. We're not going to let you fly. And Betty had seen this before. She'd fought it before and knew just what to do. And basically the women just never had a period the entire time of the war until the Army Air Forces said, okay, we give. Because they just, what are you going to do about it? They knew it was ridiculous. They knew they could fight it. And so they really strategized and figured out ways to beat that once again. There was another issue at some of the bases in Romulus and out in California as well, where either the commanding officer or in California, the wives of the pilots didn't want the women ferry pilots to fly in the same direction as the men. They were afraid that they didn't want them in the same plane as the men. They didn't want them flying the same direction as the men because the argument was, one, it would protect the women's reputation if they didn't fly near the men, and the wives of the pilots out in California didn't want them seducing their men pilots. So this was a real fight, and Nancy Love took some really strong risks pushing back and keeping the women in the air and keeping them flying for sure. So that they could have caved. They could have said, yes, we won't fly, or yes, we won't fly with men, but it would have taken away the whole purpose of what they were doing, and it was ridiculous. And so they stood up and they fought. One of the biggest battles that the women faced was becoming an official part of the military. They were brought in initially as civilians with the plan that they would serve for 90 days, kind of a 90-day probation, and then be brought in as second lieutenants. This is what the Army Air Forces did with men pilots. With men civilian pilots, they would come in, serve for 90 days, and become service pilots. And you can actually see the intention of this plan in the name WASP, right? They are essentially women service pilots. They do the same type of work that the men service pilots did. The men had wings that had an S on them. And these are women service pilots doing those kind of domestic flying jobs. The story goes that General Arnold really liked nice acronyms, so they put in Air Force there so that it's WASP, which is a nice little acronym. The Army Air Forces worked with Congress for a whole year. From 1943, from the summer of 1943 all the way to the summer of 1944 to get legislation forward to get the women in. Jackie Cochran and Nancy Love both worked with General Arnold and Congress to try to get the support. There was a lot of opposition to the women. There were civilian men pilots who were losing their draft deferment and started giving very negative press, negative things out in the world about all these glamour girls, and you can see from this photo exactly how glamorous the WASP were, and that the women were just playing games. And if you're familiar with that Life magazine issue, was Shirley Slade on the cover in her braids on the wing of a plane. They're either girls or glamorous or trying to steal the men, something like that. The bill ends up failing. The WASP lose by 17 votes. They are not officially brought into the military. And it's obviously a very long story, but they end up losing. They fight The Army Air Forces fights, the women fight, Jackie fights, but they end up being told they're going home in December of 1944. Now, if you know your World War II history, the war is still ongoing. It's in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge when they're actually sent home. And many of the women are very unhappy. Vi Cowden talked about that she was very sad and desperately embarrassed because she said that she thought she was winning the war all by herself, and then she's told to go home. She was no longer needed. Bucky Richards, Faith Buckner Richards, some of you may have known her. She talked about the fact that she was not a very nice person in the months after disbandment. But then what do they do? All right, what do they do next? Some of the WASP went back to college. Dora went back to college. Some got married. This is Dee Dee Mormon on the left here with the pilot that she met during the war. Dee Dee, of course, was one of the two that flew the B-29. That's Ethel Meyer Finley there with Mr. Finley. Ethel was the flight instructor that we saw. She got married, and that's Bee Haydu there with her husband Joe and her 3 kids. And married and started a family for many of these women. But a lot of them weren't ready to do that or didn't choose to do that. So what do? They've had all this flight experience, expensive flight experience, and they wanted to be pilots. Of course, the airlines wouldn't hire them as pilots. There was already a glut of pilots on the market, and we all know what that means to the industry. Bee Haydu used to give speeches and talk about she never heard no written in so many ways. This idea of, we don't need that many pilots, and we're certainly not going to hire a woman pilot. So what did these women who wanted to keep flying do? Some found flying jobs. There were a lot of inexpensive warbirds around after the war, and they'd buy their own plane and fly as a skywriter. You can see her wearing her old WASP uniform in the post-war years. Some started their own FBOs, right? Marjorie Gray started her own fixed base operation and offered all sorts of flight services. There were others who were kind of young and bored. That's Carol Bailey Bosca there, the woman in the very first picture with me and Curtis Pitts. There on the right, that's her Pitts Special, the #2 Pitts Special that was ever built with her 1951 aerobatic championship. On the same day she won that championship, she broke an altitude record in that Super Cub there for Mr. Piper, going up, and that record held till the 1980s when a Mooney finally broke it for the class. So she joined an air show and did these great stunt flying. This is Caddy Landry Steele, who some of you may have known Caddy. She was a hilarious straight shooter. She was very, very wonderful, but she joined the air show too. It had one of those old comedy acts with the clown routine of Caddy's crate there. And this picture on the left here, I only show it to select audiences who will appreciate it. That's Caddy in 1950 in a Waco. That is JATO. That is a jet-assisted takeoff in a Waco. And so that was her big stunt. But they did all sorts of fun flying. Carol was well known for her sailplane act, and they just did all these different things to get through those post-war years and to keep flying and having fun while they were young. Other WASP went on and did great things. Of course, we have women flying in the Air Race Classic and other air races. That's Betty Gillies in the airplane with her partner at one of the great air races of the 1950s and 60s. Of course, Jacqueline Cochran goes on and becomes the first woman to break the speed of sound and all her great test flying. And the WASP, many of them are working and running their businesses, but they start to miss their friends. And they finally do get together in 1964 as a group again. They had kind of had reunions in the late 1940s, but by 1951 or so, they kind of fell apart as an organization. Then in 1964, the Christmas of 1963, Marty Weil, who many of you might have known, Marty Weil wrote cards to her friends and said, let's get together. And so they had their first reunion at a 99s banquet in 1964. They had tables set aside for former WASP, and that's when they started getting back together with the 99s. This color picture here is from 1972 when the WASP had a huge reunion back in Sweetwater, Texas, and the town showed up for them. They had a parade. You could see the women are all getting into their old uniforms and very happy to be there. So they really do come back together, and they've found each other again, and they've found themselves again after they've kind of had that lost decade. Now, this is one of my favorite stories of perseverance. You know, the WASP were technically civilians. There were all sorts of circumstances why they weren't made military in 1943, 1944. And by the 1960s, they were beginning to retire. Many of them, over 200 of them, had joined the Air Force Reserves, some in the Air Force proper. Pat Pateman served in the Air Force, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And so they come together and decide, it's time we were remembered. We've been forgotten, and we want to be recognized as the veterans that we were. We want to have that flag on our coffin. You know, these women are in their early 50s now, and it's time. And so they spend years. First, Teresa's leading the fight, and then they come together and get organized. They get great allies that are going to work with them. This is Bruce Arnold, who is the son of General Arnold, who of course had been a great advocate for the WASP. And this is Barry Goldwater. And those of you who are pay enough attention to old politics or lived through it know that Barry Goldwater is considered the father of modern conservatism, and you know, is one of just a handful who voted against the Equal Rights Amendment in 1972, and all of these contradictions. And then he becomes one of the biggest advocates of the WASP, getting recognized as veterans because he had been a service pilot in World War II, because he had served with these women pilots, and he knew the work that they did, and he knew that they should have been considered a veteran just as he was. The story of the WASP fighting for their veterans recognition is one of you know, hard work and smarts, luck, strategy. The picture there on the left, that roll there that you see is a petition. They had petitions signed all over the United States. Everyone from Millie Young would drive her bicycle from construction site to construction site, from bar to bar, and go into the bar and tell the story, and everybody'd buy her a drink and sign their petition. One WASP was out in California for a new movie called Star Wars. She set up a little card table outside of Star Wars, and everybody signed as they went past. So those are all hand-signed petitions that are then taped together and rolled, all people saying, yes, let's make these women veterans. Let's recognize them as the veterans they are. You can see in the center of this picture, so this is Bee Haydu, for those of you who knew Bee, and this is Elaine Harmon, who we'll see more of here. Over here, this is Dora, who, again, she flew that B-29. She was one of the first women flying towing the targets. She flew the B-29. She went on to get her PhD right after the war, and worked as a test pilot and human flight engineer for Bell Helicopter. She's one of the first Whirly girls as well. Just really a story of all of these women working together in a time when you don't have the internet, when you're making calling trees, calling one another, when you get the Stars and Stripes to put an article, a weekly article in the paper, so the WASP could all subscribe and then get their news from that. It was just this incredible story of perseverance until they are finally recognized as veterans in 1977. You know, a good 5 years after, as a group they started, and a good 10 years after Teresa James had started her own efforts. And then this slide, I say, no, really, we're veterans, because the way the bill was written, this PL 95-202, it was written in a way that by the time the politics shifts in the early 1980s, the WASP were limited in what they could achieve. They already knew that they weren't going to get full veterans benefits, right? The GI Bill was gone, all the credit for going to college, all those things that would have meant so much to people like B. Haydu, to Shootsy Reynolds, you know, even Teresa James. They all said having a college education would have changed their lives. And the way the bill was written was the WASP were veterans for purposes of the Veterans Administration. So when Elaine Harmon applied for a job and wanted to get some recognition as veterans preference, right, those veterans preference points, and there were other WASP who were retiring after serving in the armed forces for 2 decades or more, and they weren't getting those veterans points for the time that they had served in the war. They actually went back to Congress. Whereas in 1977, there were hundreds of WASP who came to Washington, hundreds of WASP who were involved in the fight. Now in 1982, it was a very small number. Elaine talked about the fact that once we got our veteran status in 1977, everybody was like, oh, we're veterans now, good. But in reality, there was limitations to what they wanted. And I've got a picture here of Elaine testifying before Congress. Elaine and a couple of other WASP testified before Congress in 1982. Felt very bad about it. They got very little recognition. But I've added this little, this is the end of a letter Barry Goldwater was writing to Elaine, saying, you know, the way Congress and the way the Veterans Administration is looking at the WASP law is not what we intended. You know, we intended to correct it. And he makes the point here that the reason they were missed before was because they were not considered persons, that women were not considered persons. That was the ruling that was made against them. So this idea of the WASP being disqualified was really you know, not what he intended, not what the WASP thought they had achieved. And this is something that they lost. You know, they've continued to fight, they continued to write, and Elaine talked about that they just kept hitting a brick wall and nobody cared anymore. And they gave up. They didn't win this one. So I think even when you lose, that idea of trying and working hard is still a good lesson. You can't win them all, but you can still try. Now this, I think, has been current news, and a lot of people know about this. And this is Elaine. And Elaine Harmon was a close friend of mine. She was the first WASP I interviewed with oral histories in 1996. So I knew her well. And when she died, she wanted to be in Arlington National Cemetery. She was from Silver Spring, Maryland, nearby. And this was something that she felt like she had achieved, right? She was a big part of the fight in the 70s, again, fighting in the early 80s, and had gone to funerals of other WASP at Arlington National Cemetery. She had represented the WASP. If you know the picture of the WASP when they got the Congressional Gold Medal, when President Obama is signing it, B. Haydu and Elaine Harmon are 2 of the 3 WASPs standing there, along with Lorraine Rogers. But when she died, she wanted to be at Arlington. And Arlington National Cemetery had changed their policy and said, nope, WASP are no longer allowed. And they had been in Arlington since the early 1980s, been allowed to be in. They said, nope, because of the way the bill was written, that they are eligible for benefits from the Veterans Administration, and Arlington National Cemetery is run by the Secretary of the Army. You are not eligible to be here, and we don't have room anyway. Well, Elaine's family had learned the story of perseverance. They had learned about fighting for what was right. And her granddaughters fought, and her mother fought, and they got allies in Congress, both the House and the Senate, and they fought to get Arlington opened back up to the WASP. And so a bill was written and passed so that Elaine could be in Arlington National Cemetery, along with the other WASP, any other WASP who wanted to, and others who were tied to the WASP bill, including the Merchant Marines and others. So that idea of fighting for that right, fighting to the very end. These women taught their children to fight, and they carried it forward. And that final moment of perseverance, or that final bit of perseverance of the WASP, even beyond the grave, is that fight to be remembered, that desire to not be forgotten, not only what they did during the war, but what those 38 women who died during the war had sacrificed. In 1992, the WASP voted among their membership to make Texas Women's University in Denton, Texas, their official archive. That's the library where their archives are held right now. Tens of thousands of photographs, diaries, letters, uniforms, anything that you can think of, they have there at TWU. They loan materials out to libraries, to museums. So any museum who wants to have an exhibit on the WASP can contact TWU. It's a place, because the WASP realized by the 90s that their days were sadly numbered, and they wanted to have a place that people could go when they wanted to learn about them and tell their story. This photograph on the right is one of my favorite, because it's another thing that the WASP did, is they started telling their story more and more. In the 1990s is when they started going to Oshkosh, to the EAA as a group. Of course, they went to Sun and Fun and had always been going to 99's events, but they started telling their story as broadly as they could, so we would all know it. This is a group out at the Jesuit Retreat House on Lake Winnebago, where they stayed when they were at Oshkosh. And I would argue that they've passed it on to us, right? It's our job now to carry on, to have learned their lessons of perseverance, and to carry on their story, and to tell that to as many people as we can. So thank you very much for listening to their story and for your time this evening.